Let's look at factoring polynomials. This is something that we often have to do either for the purposes of getting a sketch of a graph or to rewrite our integrals. And there's some basic things. We're not going to do heavy-duty factoring where you have to go into rational zeros tests and all that, but I do want to review some of the basic ideas that you use factoring polynomials, at least in this course. So the most basic is just taking out a greatest common factor, or GCF. So say, for example, we had 6x to the fourth minus 10x cubed plus 4x squared. We could, each one of these terms has x's in it, so there's some amount of x's we can take out. And 6, 10, and 4 have a factor in common, so we can take out 2 as far as the coefficients are concerned, and we can, the lowest degree of x we have is x squared. So they all at least contain an x squared. So we can take that out, and we're left with 3x squared minus 5x plus 2. So that's the first thing to look for when you're trying to rewrite a polynomial. Is there anything common I can take out? Check the x's, check the coefficients for anything in common. And then let's look at what we have left over here. We can do what's called factoring by grouping if, recall, that number and that number, when you multiply them, gives us 6. If there are factors of positive 6 that add up to a negative 5, we could factor that even further. And there are. You could factor as a negative 3 and a negative 2. So I'm going to break up that middle term as negative 3x minus 2x plus 2. This is called grouping, if you recall from algebra. And now, notice that's just an equivalent form of that, but because of the fact that those factors add to negative 5 and multiply to 6, at this point, when we take a greatest common factor out of here and greatest common factor out of here, we'll be left with something we can factor out. So here I can take out a 3x. And here I can take out a negative 2. Notice we end up with that common x minus 1 factor. And so now I can take that x minus 1 out. And we're left with that. So a couple of ideas to remember: grouping and greatest common factors. And grouping was actually a more complicated form of just trinomial factoring. Let's recall what you do if this lead the easier case is if that lead coefficient is 1. So let's just look at a quadratic where our lead coefficient there is 1. So say we had x squared, let's say minus 7x plus 10. So in the case where this a equal 1, meaning that lead coefficient is 1, all I really need, it's actually a simpler form of this, since 10 times 1 is just 10, I just look at that number, 10, and ask myself, are there factors of 10 that would add to negative 7? And yes. And here we can dispense with the grouping when the lead coefficient is 1. We know that'll just break up as x minus 5, x minus 2, because these multiply to give you 10, and they add to give you negative 7. Like I said, there's much more we could say about factoring, but we tend to keep the factoring fairly simple so we can focus on the calculus. But you'll occasionally be taking out common factors, maybe grouping some, probably more often just this basic quadratic factoring where the lead coefficient is 1. The last thing I did want to mention is you can do this same thing in what's called quadratic in form. Meaning it has this kind of a form, but instead of being x squared and x, it's some function of x squared and some function of x. So we could have, say, let's just use that same polynomial as an example, but instead of x's, let's say it was a function like tangent theta. So say it was tangent squared theta minus 7 tangent plus 10. So the thing to recognize is that's the same function. If we replaced that with an x, it would look like this. So it'll factor in the same way, except for instead of these being x's, they're tangent or whatever function that was. That could have been a square root function, natural log, whatever. But it'll factor as, instead of x minus 5, tangent minus 5, and instead of x minus 2, tangent minus 2. So make sure you're comfortable with at least these 3 basic things in factoring: taking out a common factor, grouping, and then the case of just lead coefficient 1, either a quadratic, a pure quadratic of x, or even a quadratic in form. That will come up occasionally for us.